The prodigious apologist William Lane Craig said, "Without the belief in the resurrection, the Christian faith could not have come into being. The disciples would have remained crushed and defeated men. Even had they continued to remember Jesus as their beloved teacher, his crucifixion would have forever silenced any hopes of his being the Messiah. The cross would have remained the sad and shameful end of his career. The origin of Christianity, therefore, hinges on the belief of the early disciples that God had raised Jesus from the dead." The resurrection of Jesus is therefore a vitally important doctrine of Christianity. But is it defensible? Does it stand up to scrutiny? As we look back through our series, there's little doubt that Jesus was a very capable and often controversial teacher. Many claimed that Jesus was performing miracles, and he was finally caught up in a phony trial and then executed. These are the historical facts accepted by thoughtful skeptics and believers alike. Even Jesus' empty tomb is readily accepted as a historical certainty. The empty tomb is accepted as a historical certainty. So generally speaking, the life, the death, and even the empty tomb of Jesus are treated as historically reliable facts. They pass inspection, they survive scrutiny. But the resurrection seems to fall into a different category. As you might know, we Christians believe Jesus really did die and yet came back from the dead. And not that he came back from the dead in a spiritual sense, perhaps like a ghost or a phantom, but a true resurrection of Jesus in his own physical body. So the question is, what proof is there to support this Christian belief? What evidence did Luke, the author of this text, bring to the table to convince those who was reading his gospel account? Before we answer this, keep in mind that Luke has been giving us a detailed account of Jesus' death and burial and even the empty tomb. He's been researching, he's been speaking to eyewitnesses, he has got the data in front of him, and he is writing the account of it. And these accounts are reliable, and many find them accurate and trustworthy. Even skeptics would find Luke, just as a historian, would find Luke reliable and trustworthy to record history accurately. And what we'll see today is evidence which I believe fits the same category. What Luke is presenting to us is, in fact, reliable, accurate, and trustworthy. Luke provides us with first-hand accounts and experiences with the resurrected Jesus. But right off the bat then, we do have to deal with an argument put forward by skeptics and detractors of Christian faith. This is an argument someone might make if you were just to talk to them. What do you make of Jesus' empty tomb and the claim that he was resurrected from the dead? They might say something like this. They might say, the earliest disciples were simply uneducated and gullible people, highly susceptible to superstitious beliefs. They were simpletons. If you told them that the earth is flat, a good number of them might believe you. If you told them that their beloved rabbi was back from the dead, A good number of them might believe you just the same. But this is a hopelessly shallow and naive argument to make. As we followed Luke's account of the disciples, there is simply no suggestion these were people who were easily persuaded about anything. For the most part, they behaved like skeptics themselves. 2 weeks ago, we read how a few women told these disciples about the empty tomb and that perhaps Jesus is back from the dead. And did these disciples go along with them like gullible and superstitious people? Did they gobble that up? No. No, they did not. Luke told us these disciples thought these words about the empty tomb and the resurrection were an idle tale, and they did not believe them. The same theme of deep doubt and hesitancy to believe is embedded in our passage as well. If you look at verses 13 to 18, we find two disciples, hesitant and doubt-ridden. In fact, the text describes these disciples on a rather dreary walk home. And we're talking with each other about all these things that had happened. The picture here is of two disciples in strong discussion with one another. This is intense conversation, trying to understand Jesus' death and also reports of an empty tomb. These guys are going at it. How do we explain this? We know Jesus died, and now someone is telling us the tomb is empty. How are we going to make sense of this? They can't find any good answer which ties it all together. They can't find a solution to why Jesus lived, why he died, and now the tomb is empty. They can't stitch it all together. And so they're having this conversation to try and figure it out. But what's interesting is this. Nowhere in their conversation do we see them even suggesting or even entertaining the idea that maybe, just maybe, Jesus was raised from the dead. Neither of them puts the resurrection forward as a plausible answer to it all. Further indication of their doubt and hesitancy to believe in the resurrection is also given in the following verses. Jesus, whom they did not yet recognize, joined them. And then he asked about their conversation. What are you guys talking about? You guys are obviously having an intense and thoughtful conversation. What are you guys talking about? And the disciples answered with what is essentially their confession of faith, the things that they know and believe to be true. And they know and believe the following to be true: that Jesus was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people; that Jesus was condemned to death and crucified. They hoped that Jesus was the one to redeem Israel. And it has been 3 days, and messianic momentum seems to be fading. And what really puzzles them are credible reports of his empty tomb. No one can find his body. And to top it all off, courageous and sound-minded women insist they met angels who said Jesus is alive. But for all this, they weren't personally convinced. Not yet. Not yet. So how did these two disciples become convinced of Jesus' resurrection. The pattern here is somewhat telling. Jesus, whom they did not yet recognize, took them on a crash course in the Bible. Meaning he sought to persuade them from the Scriptures. And this is important. Jesus sought to persuade these doubting disciples from the Scriptures. And that is important. Jesus demonstrates his commitment to letting the Word do the work of convincing his disciples of the truth. Look at verses 25 to 27. Jesus said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself." One thing on almost every Bible student's wish list is to know what Jesus said in that conversation. And it would be really interesting to know what Jesus said, wouldn't it? Imagine being able to climb in that time machine and to go back just to listen in. To what passages did Jesus turn to explain the Christ should suffer and then enter into his glory? How did he guide and develop that conversation with the disciples? How did he help his disciples connect all these dots and questions that they had about Jesus? We don't know. We don't know. But maybe we could attempt a guess. Remember, the big question troubling these disciples was this: how could the Messiah, this Jesus whom they believed in, how could the Messiah suffer if he was destined to triumph? How could that be? It seemed to be a contradiction, a spanner in the works, an unanticipated problem hindering the fulfillment of God's plan. But there is an answer. The disciples must see it is not a case of either the Messiah will triumph or he will suffer. It is not an either-or thing. It is a both-and thing. The Bible makes the promise and tells the story of a Messiah, Jesus, who suffered in order to triumph. The Bible story is the story of a Messiah who suffers in order to triumph. And evidence for this is all over the Bible if we're only willing to look. Perhaps think about the earliest promise, and this was a wonderful insight to me as I was studying the text in the past week or two. If we think about the very earliest promise of the gospel, Adam and Eve had just rejected God's good command and then fell into sin. But as absolutely low as that moment was, God made a promise of a Messiah who would one day bruise the head of Satan. The Messiah will triumph. He will bruise the head of Satan, and Satan will bruise his heel. The Messiah will experience injury along the way. He will triumph, but he'll suffer in order to do it. As early as Genesis, the expectation was for the Messiah to triumph through suffering. And we could go on to passages in Isaiah. The Messiah gave his back to those who strike and his cheeks to those who pull out the beard. He hid not his face from disgrace and spitting. And yet Isaiah makes it perfectly clear This suffering Messiah is also the one who triumphed because he bore the sins of many. He will definitely suffer, Isaiah says, but he will triumph. We could go to Zechariah, who speaks of the Messiah's triumph over the nations. Yet he is also the one upon whom people will look, him whom they have pierced. They shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child. There are so many Bible passages and verses to choose from to show this connection between a suffering Messiah and a triumphant Messiah. And it really would make our heads spin if we were to consider them all in a single sitting. But whatever Jesus said during that walk with his disciples, whatever passages Jesus turned to explain to them, look, everything is going according to plan. The Christ, the Messiah, must suffer and then enter into his glory. It's all going according to plan. Nothing got derailed. It's all according to plan. Whatever verses and passages Jesus turned to, that must have been one of the best and most persuasive conversations in history. And so Jesus took them to the Bible to connect the dots, and it turns out the disciples were partly right, but only partly right. They could conceive of a Messiah who would triumph, that the Messiah would in fact redeem Israel, but in order to save his people, he would suffer first. That's the bit that they weren't quite getting yet. They understood the Messiah would triumph. They couldn't understand the suffering bit just yet. And so they must learn that the Messiah's path is the path of the cross to the crown, from death to life, from humiliation to exaltation. That is the path of the Messiah. And yet even here, with these disciples fully loaded and primed with this clear as day biblical insights from the mouth of Jesus himself, they still did not physically recognize Jesus. In their minds, the person who was explaining the Bible to them, trying to persuade them that everything is going according to God's plan, is perhaps just a fellow traveler, well-versed, surely, but just another traveler who's coming back from his pilgrimage, the Passover pilgrimage in Jerusalem. So how did the penny drop? How did these disciples go from Bible exposition to a firmed up faith which insisted that they saw and experienced the resurrected Jesus? How did they go from that, not recognizing Jesus, not really understanding the scriptures yet, getting an exposition from Jesus, and then going, "You are Jesus"? How does that happen? The disciples reached their destination. It was getting late, and it seemed their tutor was traveling a little bit further. And I think here we have to recognize there is a level of playfulness in the text. First, Jesus pleaded ignorance. Remember when he first joined their journey, he pleads a bit of ignorance. What happened in Jerusalem that has you guys so upset? Tell me what's been going on. And now he acted as if he were going farther. Of everything that we have learned about Jesus, it would be completely out of character to imagine any malice or deceit in Jesus' motives here. You know, as if Jesus was trying to trick them, pretending, when he full well knew that he was going to go to their house and share a meal together. He's not a trickster. Instead, what Jesus does here echoes what God did back in Genesis. Remember, he asked Adam after the fall of humanity, he asked Adam, "Where are you?" It's not because God didn't have a clue where Adam was, that Adam was really good at hide and seek. It's not that. God fully knew where Adam was. But he was looking to draw out a response from Adam, a confession, something relational from Adam. And so here with Jesus, by his apparent signaling of traveling further, he draws out hospitality from his disciples. It's an opportunity to reveal the disciples' hearts to Jesus with a invitational and hospitable people like Jesus taught them to be to strangers. Had a discipled life formed within them, which it turns out it did. They were all too happy to be hospitable to this person who to them is for the moment only a stranger. And this creates that delightful moment where Jesus disclosed himself to them. Look at verses 29 to 31. Jesus went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and he blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. This is where the penny dropped. This is where all the pieces of the puzzle start to click into place. Unknowingly, what a surprise that must have been to them, that unknowingly they had been walking and talking with the resurrected Jesus. And now they recognized him as such. They experienced him. Their eyes saw his physical form. Their ears heard his vocal cords. Their hands took bread from his actual hands. Some would go further, suggesting that it was in this moment when Jesus handed them bread that the disciples saw those unmistakable marks of Roman crucifixion in his wrists. Perhaps like a confirming detail which convinced them this really is Jesus. I don't know whether that's true or not, or just one of those things that Christians say from time to time. But whatever it was, these disciples now knew and were unrestrainably convinced that Jesus is alive. And so the sequence so far has been from the disciples' doubt and hesitancy on that road to Emmaus to persuasion through the word to experiential confirmation. Doubt and hesitancy, biblical explanation, and a fully alive faith. It is a well-worn theological journey that many of you have walked also. A journey from doubt to inquiry and explanation to a lively faith. And it really is a lively faith that we see in the disciples, isn't it? Look at verse 33. Remember, it's already late. It's past dinner time. But they just personally encountered the resurrected Jesus. So what do? what do? Late at night, it's after dinner, it's time to go to bed, but they have just experienced the resurrected Jesus. So what do? They rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. 7 miles, let's say 11 kilometers, in the dark, on foot, to find fellowship with other Christians. Let that sink in. On some Sunday mornings, it might feel like traveling 5 kilometers in an air-conditioned car in the daytime to be with other Christians, a task that requires something superhuman from us. These disciples walked 11 kilometers in the dark to find fellowship. That has to be the mark of genuine faith, wouldn't you say? There's something lively in them. They cannot be restrained. They have to go do this thing. Faith like this cannot help itself from being and doing Christian things. It's like a compass that cannot help itself from finding true north. It is actually impulsive to do so. It is impulsive to do so. And there in Jerusalem, late in the evening, they found 11 disciples, along with a few others, gathered together. And those disciples, remember, they had seen and experienced the same thing. They're poring over their evidence just like these two guys were. They understood Jesus' teaching. They saw him die. They knew he was put in a tomb. And then they heard the tomb was empty. They're all trying to figure out the same thing. They're also trying to figure out what these women meant when they remembered Jesus said that he would rise from the dead on the 3rd day. And to top it all off, one of them, Simon Peter, was convinced Jesus appeared to him alive. That's an awful lot to think through over 3 days. Your Messiah crucified, and now people are saying his tomb is empty. No one can find his body. And people are saying he has appeared to us alive. So what was the one explanation that made best sense of all this evidence? What ties it all together? Verse 34. The Lord has risen indeed. And because of this, the world can no longer be the same. Every molecule and every atom is now reverberating with the expectation that Jesus would free them from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. That creation itself would one day follow the same resurrection pattern of Jesus. In fact, the Apostle Paul rattled off a long list of Christian convictions that all squarely rest upon Jesus' resurrection from the grave. And in his assessment, because the Lord Jesus has risen from the grave, he says to us that Christian faith is therefore genuine faith, the only true faith. It means that our sins are in fact forgiven, that death itself has now been conquered, and believers will get perfectly imperishable resurrected bodies. And our Christian hope and obedience and sacrifice in this lifetime speaks of the world which is to come. All of this rests on the certainty that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, for which the evidence is very strong and trustworthy. Let me pray for us.